Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream are made possible by the generous support of PNC and the Raskin Family Fund, with additional funding from Cleveland State University, Robert Conrad, and the Payne Fund.
That was a thrill. Well, good afternoon, and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Marcia Egbert, Senior Program Officer at the George Gund Foundation and a truly proud City Club member. 49 years ago, Robert F. Kennedy spoke from this podium and admonished his audience on the dangers of ignoring our common humanity, be it through, in his words, the slow destruction of a child by hunger, schools without books, or homes without heat in winter. He said then that we knew what we must do. We must, he urged, achieve true justice for our fellow citizens. Flash ahead to 2017, and we find ourselves in a time when it can feel like the ties that bind are fraying on our national stage, and achieving true justice can seem as elusive as in 1968. Times such as those and now call for those brave citizens who will speak truth to power and do so with an unshakable belief in the value of each and every person in our society. We are so fortunate to be joined by just such a citizen today. Robert Greenstein is the founder and president of the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. The center's been described in the Washington Post as the fastest, fairest, and smartest policy think tank in Washington. And Bob himself was selected as a MacArthur Genius Grant recipient for his work in making the center a model nonpartisan research and policy organization. So if you ever wanted to know what genius looks like, voila. Beyond the vital focus of the center on the impact of government fiscal policy and budgeting on citizens' lives, particularly low-income citizens, what underlies the center's mission is a profound belief that every person has value, no matter how poor, how small, how vulnerable. A belief that the least among us deserves not only respect, but also, and particularly relevant in the context of today's forum, deserves the investment of our state and federal resources. That investment often comes in the form of government supports to help meet basic human needs. So whether it's health care through Medicaid and Medicare, food through the SNAP program, or a roof overhead through the National Housing Trust Fund, all of these essential investments are under threat today. The future of historic federal anti-poverty programs is uncertain. What could be the long-term effects of this debate? Here in Cleveland and around the country, it's in this environment that the center enters the picture, and Mr. Greenstein joins us today. As our great colleague, Amy Hanauer, Executive Director of Policy Matters Ohio, and a key partner of the center, said in a terrific piece in this week's Plain Dealer, quote, "Through tireless and impassioned efforts, Bob and the center have helped preserve access to the essentials for millions of struggling Americans," end quote. And that is certainly true right here in Cleveland and across Ohio. So cutting through the dense thicket of federal and state bureaucracy, Washington doublespeak, and endless fiscal spreadsheets, Bob and his team find what lies at the heart of any government program: people. Children, families, seniors, veterans, each shouldering a unique struggle, each seen by the center as deserving to have their voice heard through the power of facts and data, not rhetoric, not sound bites. As all of us in this room would likely agree, good public policy matters. We know it helps children learn, workers prosper, families realize the American dream. Robert Kennedy stood here nearly half a century ago, knowing that story needed to be told if justice was to be achieved. Today, nobody can tell that story with a more informed perspective than Robert Greenstein. So, ladies and gentlemen, members and friends of the City Club of Cleveland, please join me in welcoming Bob to the podium.
and to all of you for coming. You know, I feel a little like I'm coming home. When I was a young boy growing up in Philadelphia, I loved baseball, but I had no local team to root for in the postseason because the Philly teams were awful. So in 1954, I was pulling hard for the Indians in the World Series against the New York Giants, but they fell short in part because of a guy named Willie Mays, the greatest ball player I've ever seen. I've also become a huge fan of your Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, where I spent 90 wonderful minutes just this morning. But unfortunately, I need to turn to more somber topics today, topics of grave concern to the nation, the state of Ohio, and the city of Cleveland. I'll start by talking about federal budget and healthcare debates in Washington and how they affect us, and then turn to some related policy issues here in Ohio. As I'm sure you know, each year the President of the United States proposes a budget for the coming year, and President Trump proposed his budget on May 23rd. Congress may begin working on the budget as early as next week. The Trump budget is different from any that I've seen from any president of any party in the 45 years I've been working on these issues. It's startling in two basic ways. First, it is surprisingly unprofessional. President Trump has outlined a very large tax cut that he says will be one of the biggest tax cuts in U.S. history, but his budget makes a series of assumptions that few analysts find credible, such as assumptions of soaring economic growth year after year, and it uses those assumptions to claim that its massive tax cuts won't cost anything at all. Next, his budget proposes to repeal the federal estate tax, but it then continues to count the revenue from that tax as though the tax would remain in place. Secondly, the budget proposes the most aggressive Robin Hood in reverse budget and tax policies that any modern president has ever proposed. It proposes remarkably large tax cuts for those at the top, and remarkably severe budget cuts in social programs for those who face hard times, cuts in one program after another for working poor families, disadvantaged children, and others, which would push millions of Americans either into poverty or deeper into it. The budget is especially harsh on people who live paycheck to paycheck or otherwise struggle to get by, and on states and localities, including places like Ohio and Cleveland. Consider the following. The budget embraces the House-passed bill to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act, which the Congressional Budget Office estimates will cause 23 million more Americans to become uninsured, leave millions of others with less coverage, and pose particularly serious problems for many people who are aged 50 to 64 or have pre-existing conditions. And then the Trump budget adds even more Medicaid cuts on top. The budget also cuts nearly $200 billion over 10 years from the food stamp program, now called SNAP, both by cutting the program directly and by forcing states to pay a quarter of food stamp benefit costs. In Ohio, this would shift $4 billion in food stamp costs to the state budget over the coming decade. Now, Ohio and other states would be allowed to lessen the hit to the budget by cutting food stamp benefit levels. That is, the Trump budget proposes to end the national food stamp benefit standards which President Richard Nixon and Congress established on a bipartisan basis after medical researchers in the late 1960s found rates of child malnutrition and nutrition-related diseases in parts of our country that were akin to the rates in some third world countries. The Trump budget would turn back the clock. In other areas, the budget would turn back the clock even farther to decades well before the 1960s. So there's a part of the federal budget that's known as non-defense discretionary programs. It's a wonky name, but what it means, it's the part of the federal budget that includes most federal spending for education, job training, scientific and medical research, and transportation, all important building blocks for the economy of the future. It includes funds for environmental protection, food safety, national parks, veterans medical care, and a number of programs important to low and modest income people like low-income housing, Head Start, child care. This is the part of the budget that has been squeezed the most in recent years. But the Trump budget would cut it much more deeply, so much so that by 2027, under the Trump budget, total federal spending for non-defense discretionary programs would be at its lowest level as a share of the economy since Herbert Hoover was president. Yes, you heard that right, Herbert Hoover. By the way, 1/3 of federal non-defense discretionary spending goes for grants to state and local governments to help them deliver services. The Trump budget the cuts would hit Ohio and Cleveland hard. I could give you 50 examples, I'll just give you one. Under the budget in 2018 alone, Ohio would lose $137 million in community development block grant funding, with a substantial part of that loss here in Cleveland. And 3/5 of all of the non-defense cuts in the Trump budget would come from programs targeted on people with low or modest incomes, even though those programs make up less than 1/4 of federal spending. The president would cut these low-income programs a remarkable $2.5 trillion over 10 years. Now, the White House defends these cuts by saying the people who benefit from these programs should go to work. But that rings hollow. Most people on these programs who aren't children or elderly or disabled are working, but they earn low wages. Most of the rest are temporarily out of work, have worked in the past, and will work in the future. Moreover, if the president truly wants people to work, then why does his budget cut job training by 40% and make college less affordable for low-income students, even though a college education increases your employment prospects, and cut child care, which is essential for many low-income mothers to go to work? Rather than promote work, this budget proposes the deepest cuts in programs for working poor and modest income working families, many of whom voted for Donald Trump, of any budget by a modern president. And at the same time, it proposes lavish tax cuts for people at the top. Now, you may have heard it said, the Trump budget is dead on arrival in Congress. Please don't believe that. The Trump budget is in large part, I'm afraid, an exaggerated version of the budget plans that the very conservative House Republican majority has advanced every year since 2011, as well as the last budget plan that the House and Senate jointly agreed to in 2015. Every one of those budgets would have deeply cut programs for Americans of limited means, deeply cut non-defense discretionary programs, shifted costs to states and localities, and provided substantial tax cuts for those at the top. None of those budgets made their way into law because we had divided government. Barack Obama was president. But now the White House, House, and Senate are controlled by the same party, and they have the same general idea about budget cuts and tax cuts. In fact, House Republican leaders are now developing a budget, we may see it as early as next week, that reportedly includes big cuts in programs like food stamps, maybe more cuts in Medicaid on top of those in the repeal bill. And some arch-conservative members, like Ohio's Jim Jordan, are insisting that the budget mandate big cuts in programs like food stamps and assistance for poor mothers and children in order to provide financing to make the tax cuts bigger than they otherwise could be. Which leads me to health care. The Senate may vote as soon as the week of June 26th on its version of the bill to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act. This is going to be one of the most important votes in Congress in years, maybe decades. The stakes for Ohio and Cleveland are enormous. As I mentioned, the House bill would cause 23 million people to lose insurance, make coverage more expensive for millions of additional people, greatly weaken protections for people who are 50 to 64 or have medical conditions, and cut Medicaid by more than $830 billion over 10 years. Altogether, the Congressional Budget Office tells us the bill would generate more than $1 trillion from a combination of its Medicaid cuts and its cuts in subsidies to help people of modest income afford decent health insurance. And it then takes the majority of those dollars to provide tax cuts, with nearly half of the tax cuts going to the top 0.5% of Americans, those making over $1 million a year. In fact, the richest 400 Americans, people whose incomes average over $300 million a year, would get average tax cuts from the health bill, the repeal bill, of $7 million a year each. These tax cuts in the health bill are separate from, in addition to, the massive tax cuts that President Trump is talking about in his budget. Now, the impacts on Ohio, really tough. Ohio's Medicaid expansion under the Affordable Care Act, which ensures 700,000 people, would end. On top of that, the bill cuts federal funding for Ohio's entire Medicaid program, with the cuts getting bigger with each passing year. That would place all of Ohio's 3 million Medicaid enrollees and the state's health care providers at risk. And many of the 210,000 Ohioans who now get coverage through the Affordable Care Act's health insurance marketplace would be at serious risk as well, especially those, as I've noted, who have medical conditions or are older. The Medicaid cuts should be of particular concern in Ohio. Ohio has the highest number of deaths from opioid overdoses of any state. That's going to get worse if the Medicaid expansion ends. In addition, Ohio already pays doctors serving Medicaid patients less than most other states, and Ohio has already placed most of its Medicaid beneficiaries in managed care to economize. To respond to big federal Medicaid cuts, Ohio would have to cut its Medicaid program further, ending coverage for more low-income people, or scaling back the health services Medicaid covers, or cutting provider payments even more and risking having more providers decline to see patients, or cutting state funding for things like education to try to free up money to help offset the big Medicaid cuts. So action is now shifting to the Senate. Senator John Cornyn of Texas, the Senate's #2 Republican leader, has said that the emerging Senate health bill will likely retain 80% of the House bill. Based on the reporting of what's happening behind closed doors, the emerging Senate Republican bill apparently will still kill the Medicaid expansion, but just take a few more years to do so. Make no mistake, the ultimate result would be the same. The 700,000 Ohioans covered through the expansion would lose that coverage. And like the House bill, the Senate bill also would cut Medicaid funding further and shift more of Medicaid's costs to the states. Now, the repeal bill cannot pass the Senate without support from Republican senators from states that have adopted the Medicaid expansion, including Ohio. That gives those senators great leverage. Without them, the bill fails. So I'm afraid I'm amazed and disappointed that these senators are merely calling for taking a few more years to phase out the Medicaid expansion. The ultimate result would be exactly the same for 700,000 Ohioans as this graph illustrates. Senator Rob Portman, a key player here, says he hopes the hundreds of thousands of Ohioans who would lose coverage from the end of the Medicaid expansion would buy coverage on their own with the help of tax credit subsidies. But few analysts think that'll work. Most people covered under the Medicaid expansion live below the poverty line. Research shows that even modest premiums keep poor people from obtaining coverage. And the premiums for those people would not be modest, especially since the House bill cuts the subsidies way back compared to the subsidies provided today under the Affordable Care Act. Let me get specific. Under the House bill, a 60-year-old individual in Ohio with income at or below the poverty line, that's someone who's living on no more than $12,000 a year. That 60-year-old would, on average, under the House bill, have to spend half or more of his meager income just to pay the premiums for individual market coverage comparable to a standard plan in today's insurance marketplace, and that's before counting the deductibles and copays. Yes, Senate Republicans are talking about putting some more money into the subsidies and making them somewhat bigger, but even with the modifications they are discussing, this 60-year-old here in Ohio living on $12,000 a year would have to spend at least a third of her income on premiums. Poor people struggle just to pay rent, heat, and other bills. Faced with premium charges like these low-income Ohioans would become uninsured. There's extensive research that unambiguously shows that's the case. Nor is the push Senator Portman is making for some new funding to states for opioid addiction treatment a solution for the effects in that area of ending the Medicaid expansion. People don't just need treatment after they're addicted. They need health coverage to address problems that drive so many people to opioids in the first place: chronic pain, depression, other mental illness. And for people already suffering from addiction, they don't just need anti-opioid medication, they also need treatment for their underlying health conditions, which means they badly need insurance. Make no mistake here either. Ending the Medicaid expansion, sadly, will make the opioid problem worse. The problems, as I noted, would be especially serious for people with pre-existing conditions. Some Republican senators say their bill will protect these people because they will retain an Affordable Care Act provision that bars insurers from charging people with pre-existing conditions more than other people who buy the same policy. But that won't solve the problem, because the Senate bill likely will also keep a House provision that lets states scale back the ACA's essential health benefits standard, under which insurance policies must cover various important health services and treatments. So consider what would happen. Insurers would have strong incentive to offer stripped-down policies that carry lower premiums so they can compete for the business of younger and healthier people, the enrollees insurers most want. But people who have medical conditions and need treatments that the stripped-down policies wouldn't cover would have to buy comprehensive insurance plans like those offered under the ACA today, or supplemental policies. And because those who would buy the comprehensive plans or supplemental policies would largely be sicker than average people, because the young and healthy people would have been siphoned off into the stripped-down plans, the premiums for the supplemental or comprehensive policies would be very high and likely unaffordable for many people. The bottom line, many people with pre-existing conditions would be left high and dry. As we meet here today, time is short. We are very fastly approaching a Senate vote. I see two possible paths. Along one path, the Senate's Republican majority passes its bill, making tens of millions of Americans uninsured or underinsured, imposing intense financial pressure on healthcare providers who serve large numbers of lower-income people, and creating serious problems for state budgets. That would also mean considerable job losses in the healthcare sector, a particular concern here in Cleveland, where healthcare is one of the biggest sectors of employment. But there's another possible path. One of Governor Kasich's advisors said recently that the governor doesn't support healthcare legislation that, and I quote, would dislodge millions from healthcare coverage, end quote. Dislodge millions from coverage. That should be the test. Unfortunately, it's one that the emerging Senate bill will almost certainly fail. Accordingly, Senate Republicans should turn that bill aside, and congressional leaders should then launch a bipartisan effort to build on the progress that's been made in extending coverage to over 20 million people and make improvements to stabilize insurance markets, improve access, and hold down costs. But there's a precondition for that. We first need just three Republican senators to step up to the plate and reject the emerging Senate bill so it doesn't get the 51 votes it needs to pass. That crucial vote is days away. Finally, I want to talk briefly about a couple of Ohio policy issues, particularly regarding state tax policy. Now, fascinating development. 2 weeks ago, the Republican-controlled legislature in Kansas repealed very large tax cuts that it had enacted starting in 2012. Governor Sam Brownback had promised that the tax cuts would ignite economic growth and create many new jobs, and as a result, largely pay for themselves. Instead, Kansas's economic growth lagged behind that of the nation as a whole. The tax cuts caused huge budget shortfalls, forcing legislators to cut deeply into education and other priorities. This year, Kansas legislators concluded that the tax cuts had caused more harm than good, and 2 weeks ago, the legislature repealed most of the tax cuts. This is a Republican legislature, adding on a bipartisan basis. When the governor vetoed the bill, the legislature overrode him. The Kansas tax cuts represent an important cautionary tale from which both state and federal policymakers should learn, and there are few states where these lessons are more applicable and more important than here in Ohio. Your state has actually cut its top income tax rate even more deeply than Kansas had. Kansas, before the rollback, cut its rate 29% since 2012. Ohio has cut its top rate 1/3 since 2005, from a top rate of 7.5% to a rate of a little below 5%. Moreover, one of Kansas's most damaging tax cuts was eliminating state income tax on what is known as pass-through income, profits on which the owners of S corporations, sole proprietorships, and partnerships pay tax as individuals rather than as corporations. Ohio enacted a similar provision, eliminating state income tax on the first $250,000 a year in pass-through income and imposing a tax rate of just 3% on pass-through income above $250,000 a year. So what's happened? As in Kansas, the Ohio tax cuts have not delivered the promised results. As this graph shows, since Ohio started down the tax-cutting path, private employment growth in Ohio has been far below that of the nation as a whole and below most states that border Ohio. And look at this graph. This graph shows that Ohio's rate of economic growth has been below the nation's as a whole and below all neighboring states except one. And, as in Kansas, Ohio's extraordinarily generous pass-through loophole has incentivized tax avoidance, with many people reorganizing their affairs to turn regular income into pass-through income. The Columbus Dispatch recently reported that the number of Ohio tax filers using the pass-through tax break jumped by more than 50% between 2013 and 2015. As an Ohio state legislator recently noted, with this tax break, a lobbying firm in Ohio with $1 million a year in profits and 4 partners can organize itself so each partner is paid $250,000 a year and none of them pay a penny in Ohio income tax. Meanwhile, Ohio has experienced budget shortfalls that have squeezed vital areas like education. And as Policy Matters Ohio has reported, only 8% of Ohio 4-year-olds from low-income families have access to preschool, as compared to 32% nationally. And near-poor working families find it harder to get child care assistance in Ohio than in over 40 other states. Lastly, a few words on the Earned Income Tax Credit, one of the most successful anti-poverty measures we have. The EITC is a tax credit that supplements the wages of low-income working families with children. Research shows it draws large numbers of low-income mothers into the workforce and substantially reduces poverty. And the research also indicates that the increased income it provides to working poor families with children helps those children over the long run. Children and families receiving the EITC do better in school, are likelier to attend college, and can be expected to earn more as adults. With this impressive tax record, the EITC is popular with conservative and progressive poverty and labor market experts alike. In Washington, its fans range from House Speaker Paul Ryan to Senator Sherrod Brown, who is now seeking to strengthen the EITC for poor workers who aren't raising children, a group that's largely left out of the EITC today. So along with the federal EITC, 30 states have adopted state EITCs, which can further strengthen low-income working families and their children while making state tax codes less regressive. Although Ohio is one of those 30 states, it has one of the stingiest EITCs in the nation. Ohio is one of only 6 states whose EITC is not refundable, which means working poor families that don't earn enough to owe state income tax are shut out. No wage supplement for them. In fact, as the next slide shows, Ohio is the only one of 6 states, as this slide shows, Ohio is the only Great Lakes state that lacks a refundable EITC. As a result, Ohio's EITC does nothing for 92% of the poorest fifth of Ohioans, those who make less than $21,000 a year, and the 8% of them who do get an EITC get an average EITC of $70 a year. That's less than $6 a month. Ohio's EITC also has other restrictive features that no other state EITC in the country has and that lessen its work-promoting effects. And Ohio's relatively low minimum wage of $8.15 an hour compounds these problems. So that means that Ohio's tax cut features, on the one hand, an extremely costly tax loophole for pass-through income that fuels large-scale tax avoidance, especially by the affluent, while on the other hand, lacking a meaningful state EITC for Ohio families who work hard at low wages. The contrast is glaring. To learn more about it, I'm just touching the top of this here. I urge you to read an excellent report on the need for reforms in the Ohio EITC that Policy Matters Ohio issued earlier this year. And with that, I thank you for listening, and I look forward to answering your questions. Thank you.
Great job. Stay right here. Hello again, I'm Dan Moulthrop, Chief Executive here at the City Club, and this afternoon we're enjoying a Friday Forum featuring Robert Greenstein, founder and president of the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. We're about to begin the Q&A with all of you. We welcome questions from everyone, City Club members, guests, students, those of you joining us via our radio broadcast, our webcast, our live simulcast at the Parma Snow branch of the Cuyahoga County Public Library, or via Facebook Live. If you'd like to tweet a question, please tweet it at the City Club, and our staff will work it in. If you're on Facebook Live, you can leave one in the comments stream there. We want to remind you that your questions should be brief and to the point so that we can get in as many questions as possible. Holding our microphones today are Content Coordinator Teddy Eisenberg and our Director of Programming, Stephanie Jansky. May we have our first question, please?
Mr. Greenstein, Medicaid, according to the discussion we hear in the media today, seems to be a program that is devoted to repaying doctors and hospitals. Yet something on the order of 70% of all the long-term residents in nursing homes throughout the United States are being paid for by Medicaid. So it's kind of a twofold question. One, of what is being spent on Medicaid, what percentage is being paid for the care of our elderly in nursing homes? And secondly, what do you see as the prospects of nursing homes starting to do what some doctors are doing, and because of the low reimbursement rates, simply saying we're not going to take more Medicaid patients?
There was a great question. There was an important column earlier this week by 3 healthcare experts, I think in the New York Times, pointing out that if this legislation cutting Medicaid passes, that there could be particularly significant adverse consequences over time for nursing home care and home and community-based care, and that if you shrink the reimbursements nursing homes get, they will continue to take Medicaid patients, but it will probably mean fewer staff, less attention to people in the nursing homes, and that the quality of life for people in nursing homes could deteriorate. Many people mistakenly make the following distinction. They say Medicare, is for the elderly and Medicaid is for the poor. But Medicare doesn't cover long-term care. That is Medicaid. And as I'm sure many of you know, many middle-income people who end up needing institutional care late in life, or maybe earlier in life if they suffer a severe disabling event, that kind of institutional care is so expensive that people spend through their assets. And after they spend through their assets and they no longer have that kind of support, then they do qualify for Medicaid. Medicaid pays, as you indicated, Medicaid pays, I believe, the majority of nursing home care costs today in the United States for that reason. So this definitely is of particular concern. Now, before the enactment of the Affordable Care Act, we had the interesting set of statistics that people who were elderly or had disabilities were something like 1/4 of all Medicaid beneficiaries, but their care accounted for about 2/3 of all Medicaid costs. Today, their care accounts for something closer to maybe half of Medicaid costs, not because the cost of nursing home care has gone down, but because as a result of the Medicaid expansion in the Affordable Care Act, we added something like, I forget the precise figure, like 14 million people to Medicaid who are not elderly or disabled, including the 700,000 people in Ohio who get coverage through the Medicaid expansion. If the Medicaid expansion ends, then we will go back to about 2/3 of Medicaid expenditures going for people who are elderly or have disabilities, and it means that the provision of the House bill, which I understand is remaining in the Senate Republican bill, that would transform the federal financing of Medicaid by capping, regardless of actual health care costs, capping how much each state gets, that would have a significant effect here. Today, the federal government pays 63% of Ohio Medicaid costs. So if there's an epidemic Or maybe there's a breakthrough and there's a great new drug, like Sovaldi. Suppose there would be an advance in the future on Parkinson's or Alzheimer's or something. Under the current arrangements, if people on Medicaid really need those treatments, federal government pays 63% of the added cost. Ohio pays 37%. Under the bill that's moving through Congress, federal government would put a cap. This is the amount we pay per Medicaid beneficiary in Ohio, no more. So the feds would pay 63% of Medicaid costs up to and only up to the cap, and any costs above it, Ohio would have to cover 100% of them. So if costs rose for any one of a number of reasons, epidemics, medical breakthroughs, Ohio would be stuck. And worse than that, you have the question, if the cap is set initially based on current levels of cost, well, how's the cap change from year to year? And the bills on the Hill raise the cap from year to year at a rate slower than healthcare costs actually rise. So that would mean the squeeze would get bigger with each passing year. And yet there's even an additional concern, particularly relevant to your question. The way they would compute the cap under the bills is the federal government would look, let's say for Ohio, at here's the average per beneficiary cost today for the elderly in the Medicaid program, disabled, children, parents. You get a figure, you multiply that by the number of people in each category, and the total, that's your cap. That's it, that's what you get. The data show that Medicaid beneficiaries aged 85 and over have 2.5 times the average health care costs of Medicaid beneficiaries aged 65 to 75. Shouldn't be surprising. But what that means is if you base your cap on the average per beneficiary cost for elderly people today, when those boomers who are on Medicaid are in the 65 to 72 range, that when that huge baby boomer bulge moves into their 80s and old age, you blow way through the cap. And Ohio and other states are then stuck with how to cut the Medicaid program to fit within the cap. So the long-term effects of the Medicaid cap are very serious alongside the more immediate effects of losing the Medicaid expansion. Both of these are reasons why, if this legislation passes, it doesn't just turn us back to where we were in 2009 before the Affordable Care Act was enacted. For Medicaid, it makes the program much weaker than it was before the ACA was enacted and poses growing problems for people that need health coverage and have limited means, people that need nursing home care, and state budgets over time. This is one of the reasons I am so concerned about this legislation.
Hi. So there's a lot of media attention paid to the partisan sort of tribal team sport aspect of these discussions, and there's a lot of intellectual capital that is put behind the data that we're looking at. But I'm wondering, is there any research that's being put into or any effort put into the sort of psychological underpinnings that allow these true believers in sort of the tax cut strategy to justify this to themselves based on, I mean, you know, you've given us these dire circumstances and we've got reams of data to back it up, but there are so many people that turn those negatives that we're hearing and think of them as positive. So I'm wondering, do you connect your research to research about sort of why they think this is a good thing? Even you know, outside of the lies that they tell about the economic growth that would result, outside of those sort of false narratives, the psychological underpinnings, and does that connect to your data at all?
We really don't do work ourselves on psychological motivations. But it is striking the degree to which a number of people, despite all evidence to the contrary, continue to believe that big tax cuts ignite massive economic growth and pay for themselves. When the Ronald Reagan's administration put that forward in 1981, Howard Baker, the very respected Senate Majority Leader at the time, commented, "This is a riverboat gamble." And the gamble didn't work very well. People forget that in 1982, with deficits soaring, a key Senate Republican leader at that point, and someone I feel greatly privileged to have been able to work with back in those years on food stamps, actually to these days a bit of a hero of mine, may surprise some of you, Bob Dole. Bob Dole in 1982 led the effort to pass a tax increase that canceled approximately 1/3 of the 1981 tax cuts, and then there were further tax increases, smaller, in subsequent years that Ronald Reagan signed. But we keep repeating this as though we haven't learned the lesson. I do take some hope in the fact that the Kansas legislature, as I said, this is not a blue state, this is not a purple state, this is Kansas. And Kansas repealed those tax cuts. Unfortunately, we look like we could be on a path where either this year or early in 2018, Congress passes another round of big tax cuts, claiming they'll ignite economic growth. And sadly, I think the evidence is pretty strong that if we do that, we will find several years down the road they didn't ignite the economic growth. And they significantly increased deficits and caused other problems. It's particularly puzzling when the unemployment rate is 4.3%. The economy is certainly not perfect, but it's pretty close to what we call full employment. To get the idea that we need massive tax cuts to fuel the economy. The bigger the tax cuts, probably the higher the Federal Reserve will raise interest rates to compensate anyway. So it doesn't make a lot of sense. This slide is just part of this, story showing you that we really didn't get this kind of growth after the Bush tax cuts. And as people sometimes note, I remember in 1993 when Bill Clinton, in his first year as president, put together a budget. One part of which was undoing a significant share of the remaining Reagan tax cuts at the top. And the true believers you're referring to strongly predicted that within a year the economy would crash. And of course, the 1990s economy was a pretty damn good one, especially by the end of the 90s.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Your talk comes after a story I heard on the news this morning, briefly, that mentioned Trump's proposed budget, which seeks to increase defense and military spending. And it sort of flies in the face of your presentation this afternoon about proposed decreases in social programming and spending. I wonder how effective a military force, the sailors and soldiers and Marines, can be if they're going to be poorly educated, poor and sick. So what has the center found in regard to investing in the populace as a national security interest or a national security matter?
Yeah, it's a great question. Decades ago, the core of the military were big infantry troops that fought ground wars. Today, think of the conflicts we're in various places around the world. We don't have lots of troops on the ground. We use drones, we used airstrikes, all of these are technology driven. The military increasingly needs people with sophisticated technological skills, which you're absolutely right, comes back and relates to education and job training. Interestingly enough, some of you may know the origin of the National School Lunch Act, which, if I remember correctly, was enacted in 1946, was that during World War II, the US military found that it had problems with a number of troops where the kids were the people aged 17, 18, 19 coming into the military had been malnourished and weren't as physically vigorous as they needed them to be. It was one of the key motivators, actually, for establishing the school lunch program. So I think your comment's right on point.
Hi, good afternoon, and thank you again for the talk today. My question is, you talked about the baby boomer bulge as a significant portion of the population ages. So we have these proposed changes in healthcare. So my question is, as a researcher, are you able to differentiate between a population that has needs, so a baby boomer population that has needs and is getting older, versus the increased stressors on seniors as these changes are enacted? So, and you have a senior population that gets older. Is there anything that is a key indicator that says it's not just people who are aging and having issues, but actually there's an increasing number of people who are experiencing stress as a result of these changes?
There may be. I don't know those data. I was really trying to make a somewhat different point, and I fear I might not have made it clearly enough. And it is simply that the baby boomers, everybody born between 46 and 64, is a huge cohort. It's a huge number of people. So it's sort of like the bulge moving through the snake. And it's a diverse population. There are baby boomers who are very affluent. They're doing fine. I didn't mean to suggest that baby boomers, on average, fare worse than other generations. Not so at all. But it's simply the fact that because the number of people in the baby boom generation is so large, and since some fraction of them will either be low income or will ultimately exhaust resources and need institutional care, that ultimately the impacts on both Medicaid and Medicare are bigger just because there are more of them. And with respect to the Medicaid cap, my point was, if you're asking the question, what's the average cost per elderly Medicaid beneficiary? Okay, I'm going to take that number and lock it in for 50 years. If your measurement point is when the boomers are in young old age, so they're a larger share of the total senior population is in the healthier part of it, that's going to depress your per beneficiary cost. And then when the boom moves into old age, and you're stuck with that lower cost level, you got big problems on how to finance Medicaid. That was the point I was trying to make.
Mr. Greenstein, I can't thank you enough for being such a breath of fresh air. My question to you is, let's suppose that there's some rationale behind trying to diminish the national debt and start paying a little bit better for what we're spending. So the question is, who do you look for as rational leaders in our government, and what are the arguments or the proposals they have that represent more of a balanced view?
No, this is a very good question. I think one of the things we've learned over the years, at least I feel I've learned, when you can make positive changes on a bipartisan basis, they're more likely to endure and stick. I mean, we're seeing this in the Affordable Care Act was passed with entirely Democratic votes. It was unfortunate it worked out that way, especially given that it was modeled on things like the Massachusetts system that Republican Governor Mitt Romney had put through, and it reflected ideas, not single payer, but rather using market competition that were really centrist ideas, but nevertheless it became totally partisan, and it didn't embed itself as we're seeing now. It's difficult now. I mentioned Bob Dole earlier, and I did a lot of work in the 70s, early 80s on the food stamp program. And we had this partnership, surprised people at the time. There was really a close partnership. It was Bob Dole and George McGovern, and then a great guy named Tom Foley in the House. It was a centrist Democrat from Spokane, Washington. And with that kind of bipartisan, they pulled enough people in both parties behind them that they could really move forward. It's very hard to see that now. Thank you.
By my count, that was the third congressional name check, but the last is, of course, a hometown hero, Clevelander, and City Club member, I should note, as well. But all who have been mentioned today are welcome to join us here on the stage to talk about these same issues. Today at the City Club, we've been enjoying a Friday forum with Bob Greenstein, founder and president of the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. Today's forum is the annual Sadie and Maurice Friedman Memorial Forum, made possible by generous gifts from Howard R. Berger and Bob Lustig. We appreciate your generosity and your continued support of the club. Today's forum is sponsored by the George Gunn Foundation and the Mount Sinai Healthcare Foundation. We appreciate your partnership. Student participation in City Club forums is provided by many foundations, including the William E. Weiss Foundation. We thank you all for being here. That brings us to the end of our program today, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for your participation today. Mr. Greenstein, thank you very much. Our forum is adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.
Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream are made possible by the generous support of PNC and the Raskin Family Fund, with additional funding from Cleveland State University, Robert Conrad, and the Payne Fund.